113 Questions About Evolution with John Perry. Evolutionary question number 2. What is the simplest known life form? According to NASA's definition of life, which we talked about in the last video, life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Within this definition of life, all sorts of simple creatures are considered living things. Things like viruses and plasmids. Remember, a plasmid is a loop of DNA that can infect a bacteria. And even under this definition, you could consider a single gene within your own genome to be a living thing. Now, in order to do this, you have to think of the cell as the environment of that gene can reproduce and evolve inside of. And you need to think of the other genes in the genome as members of the ecosystem that gene is evolving inside of. It's a really strange way to think about genes, but you can think of a gene, a single gene in your genome, as a living creature. This is actually a really productive way to think about genes under certain circumstances. Richard Dawkins actually wrote an entire book about this called The Selfish Gene, where he encourages people to think more about genes as if they are living creatures, the basic units of evolution. One of the things about genes is that they're locked into cooperation with the other genes in their genome, and they really only reproduce or replicate when the entire genome, and in fact the entire cell, is reproducing. So they're kind of locked into cooperation. There are ways that a gene can break free from that cooperation and start to reproduce on its own, independently of the cell and independently of the other genes, but that's kind of a special circumstance. The simplest independent living creature that we know of, that we've discovered so far, would have to be the viroid. So earlier we talked about plasmids, these loops of DNA that can evolve and replicate inside of bacteria. Well, a viroid is even simpler than that. A viroid is a loop of RNA. It's a single-stranded loop of RNA that replicates inside of plant cells. Now, in order to understand how viroids work, it's really important that you understand what DNA is, what RNA is, what nucleotides are, and what base pairing is. So if you happen to be a little bit foggy on any of those topics, put this video on pause and go watch 2 animations that I did on my other channel stated clearly. One of them is what is DNA and how does it work? And the other is what is the RNA world hypothesis? I have links to them in the video description. So go watch those and then come back because we are about to learn something amazing about viroids. These are fascinating, fascinating creatures. This is the potato spindle tuber viroid. We know every nucleotide that makes up its genome, if you could even call it a genome. It was discovered recently, just in 1971, by Dr. Theodore Diener. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this viroid is constantly evolving, so different individuals vary in length and in sequence, but this is the sequence, the typical sequence that this viroid is found in. It's normally about 360 nucleotides long. It's a big long loop, and it's a squashed loop. And the reason it's a squashed loop is because it base pairs with itself. It's a single-stranded chain of RNA, but usually when you have a single-stranded chain of RNA, it's not just open and loose. It always folds up and base pairs with itself. Viroids are extremely fascinating because they do not use the genetic code. They're the only organisms we know of that don't use the genetic code. Now, they do use a protein that plants code for using the genetic code, but the viroid itself doesn't know the genetic code, doesn't speak the genetic code. It doesn't make proteins. It doesn't code for proteins. What it does instead is it gets inside of a plant cell, in this case, a potato cell, and it chemically attracts a protein called RNA polymerase II. This is a diagram of RNA polymerase II. And what this enzyme does, this protein does, is it attaches to the viroid and it starts making copies of it. It takes RNA nucleotides that the cells produced and it uses those nucleotides to make copies of the viroid. And it does this over and over and over again. Thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of the viroid are made this way. And that is how viroids make a living. They steal a protein from a plant cell and they steal nucleotides from a plant cell. And they just make copies of themselves. So there you have it. Viroids. They are the simplest known creatures on planet Earth. In fact, they are the simplest known creatures in all of the cosmos. Next question.